Welcome to Transformation Time with the Samaritan Strategy. In our previous weeks, we've been trying to discuss the holistic gospel. And in looking at the holistic gospel, we started to look at Jesus. The growth of Jesus is our model of growth and development and service. And we saw that Jesus grew in 4 areas, as we're told in Luke 2:52. Jesus grew in stature, that is the physical. He grew in wisdom. He grew in favor with God, that is spiritual. He grew in favor with man, that is social. And so, trying to understand the growth of Jesus, we saw how it's so important for the church, and for that matter, people of the church, to grow, be more and more like Him. And in that aspect, we see that sometimes we have narrowed the gospel to only the spiritual. So we saw that Jesus grew in these 4 areas. And so all His disciples, people who follow Him, must also grow in these 4 areas. And that brought us to other levels where we saw the church as a window. And we said for a long time, the church had been perceived only from the spiritual point of view. But in looking at the 4 windows of the church, we attributed it to the growth of Jesus. And we saw God has given the church 4 windows that should be clearly opened for the broken man out there to see God's intentions for his future, for his current, and for even the church. So we saw that one of the windows is the spiritual window. We also saw the physical window. We saw the social window. And we saw also the wisdom. And in dealing with this, we also came to realize that we need to see the 3 relationships that God has given us. Again, in these 3 relationships, we saw that God has given a relationship to relate to Him, spiritual things. Also, a relationship to relate to creature, as He has created the world, and He has given us the opportunity to also relate to each other, so that we can grow and live lives that brings about transformation, not only to our lives, but to the communities and society God has placed us. And we saw that the wheel of wisdom becomes so important, because for us to grow, for us to make an impact, we have to understand where the role of wisdom. Because if you have the spiritual, if you have the wisdom, you have the social, you have the physical, you don't have wisdom, growth comes needed. And so it becomes so important for us to understand why we are here on earth. We are just here not just to do church and do spiritual things, and then convert souls, and then baptize them, plant churches. That's it. We need to be God's agent of transformation. And to be an agent of transformation, you must understand these 4 areas that Jesus grew. Apply it to your life, your family life, your community life, your church life, in order for you to be able to be impactful or to be transformational. But unfortunately, many churches are still very narrow, far around their perspective. That's why today I want to look at a narrow view of the gospel. To understand this topic, various perspectives and assumptions have been made concerning evangelicals. Some people think evangelicals have 2 regular religious meetings. Meet on Sunday, they meet on Wednesday, they meet on Friday, they meet for various spiritual programs, such that they don't even have time for themselves. Again, we also see that some evangelical church members believe that government in the present world is bad. The future life that is life after death, for them is more important. And so it becomes so important for them to really hammer and specialize on spiritual things rather than on the present life. Again, after joining a church, evangelicals often drop out of close relationship with family and friends. And so we have to understand that joining a church is not to forgo about the things that you formerly are related to. So people become converts. They are born again. They lose their friends, their family members, and the relationship is completely broken. Then, some evangelicals also don't play soccer or even play social games. They don't participate in local fiestas or drink with friends who they believe are not part of them. And so they isolate themselves and discriminate against people that they are not friends with or who don't belong to the same church. The members of the evangelical church, some think and act as if they are better than other people in the community. Look down on people who are not part of a church. So if you don't belong to them, then they don't respect or regard you. Evangelicals, some of them are not very also concerned about problems of people who are not in their own group. So you have to belong to in order for you to be accepted. Again, evangelicals probably will not be interested in working to improve their community. And so, yes, they are not concerned about community development. They are concerned about their own church buildings, church environments, and they don't care about the community. Conservative Protestant Christians in some countries are often accused of preaching a gospel of resignation, meaning that critics charge evangelicals with teachings their people to resign themselves to present injustice and to the struggle to survive, because all will be well when Jesus returns or when they die and go to heaven. And so the gospel that is preached is, or what you have now, is what belongs to you. People are left to their faith. People are allowed to really think of what will be. It doesn't matter when Christ appears, that is where he will send us to the place he has prepared. And so heaven becomes something that people look up to. But anything that is not heavenly, is disregarded. And so we see that there's a lot of problems and perspective that people have concerning evangelicals, for that matter, charismatics and Pentecostals, where the focus is only on the spiritual. Now, last week, we saw, or even Wednesday, we saw that the church, God has created a very good, but this good creation is broken. Why? Because the people, his church, who are to represent his agenda on earth, do not even see their role. Some don't even know their role. They only think that their role is to evangelize, preach the word, or convert souls, plant churches, and build cathedrals. These are good. But we have to understand God's comprehensive, intentions for his word. And that's why you should understand this narrow view that many people still have. As a ministry, we have seen many African churches with a history of limited ministry to physical or social needs. Although most of the churches faithfully preach the gospel of spiritual salvation and teach their members to live a separated life, often have not reflected a biblical compassion for the physical or social needs of the people of their communities. Tragically, then, many people who live in communities where there is desperate need have the same impression that the church don't care. They care about the spiritual things. They perceive that the church is unconcerned and irrelevant to the present physical and social brokenness around it. The Bible clearly expresses God's intentions that His people proclaim and model His love, the broken lives in their midst. Why? But then, if they believe in the Bible and desire to be faithful to it, do conservative Protestant churches neglect physical and social ministry? Now, we have to understand it from the historical background. The neglect of physical and social ministry has a history that goes with it. And the missionaries that came to Africa planted the Christian churches. Most of them have this sort of conservative perspective. From the Reformation until the mid-19th century, the Protestant church was a leader in social reform. Then things began to change. First, theological liberalism began to emerge as a major influence in Protestant Christianity. This liberal Christianity believed that all people would be saved, universalism, and that Christians would bring in the kingdom of God by working to correct the problems of society. At its extreme, liberal Christianity denied the need for personal salvation and preached the good news of the gospel of societal salvation through good works. This perspective came to be known as the social gospel, whereby people thought that they could be saved by being good. In reaction to this social gospel, theologically traditional, conservative Protestants strongly promoted the need for personal salvation, and they tended to reject or relegate to minor importance issues of physical, social concern. They identified social and physical concerns as part of the theologically liberal movement and its social gospel. The conservative Christians became known as fundamentalists, evangelicals, or Pentecostals. Second theological movement, called dispensational theology, developed about 1840s. Now, time will not allow us to do all of this. But then, we have to understand, historically something happened that made the church to specialize on spiritual things. Many of the conservative Protestant churches in the third world today have been strongly influenced by missionaries who came with one or more of the following. 1. A tradition that rejects liberal theology and the associated concern for social issues. 2. A tradition of pessimism about a redeemed society. 3. A perspective that sees native people as unable to lift themselves out of poverty without outside or Western money and technology. And finally, a model of social ministry as a means for evangelism, often unreplicable or manipulated. So people think that you have to take care of the needy, the poor, and through that, you evangelize them or bring them to Christ. So when people are hungry, give them food, and through the food, they'll come to know Christ, which is manipulative. As a consequence, many churches planted by these missionaries emphasized spiritual salvation, but discounted or neglected the physical and social concerns of people, both inside and outside the church. Now, it's very interesting for us to read Isaiah 58. Now, that verse speaks to us a lot, especially concerning true fasting. Read from verse 2. For day after day, they seek me out. They seek eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of his God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted? They say, and you have not seen it. Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife, and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is it the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only the bowing one's head like a reed, and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? A day of acceptance, acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I've chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression and the pointing of finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Now, this is the type of fasting, and you should try to finish the whole of 58 Isaiah. This is the type of fasting God requires from his children. Somehow, because of the spiritual connotations we have given to fasting, people can be in corrupt situation and yet be fasting. People don't talk to one another and yet they are fasting. People are greedy in the midst of fasting. People are pulling one another down, yet they are fasting. And so, for many, they think the fasting gives us the favor of God. But Isaiah 58 is telling us the type of fast that is acceptable to God. And that is so important for us to understand that when it comes to spiritual things, it is not only read the Bible, pray, and even in things like fasting, there's the urgent need for us to understand it holistically, because it has to do humbling ourselves, sharing what you have with others. It has to do with untie the cords of the yoke. It has to do with freeing the oppressed and sharing your food. And it has to do with many of the things sometimes we think are not too important than the fasting. So it means people are fasting. A type of fasting that God does not recognize and God does not even see. Isaiah 58. In Isaiah 58, God tells Israel that their worship of him misses the mark. They think that their liturgy, their fasts, and their prayers are a sufficient expression of obedience, of spirituality. God, however, tells them that kind of worship He wants is for them to reach out to the physical and social needs of those around them. He tells them He doesn't hear them when they pray because they have failed to live out their worship Him by serving the needy. There are many other related passages in the Old Testament that attest to this. And when you read Psalm 82, verse 2 and 3, Psalm 82, 2 and 3 says, "How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed." Proverbs 14:21. It is a sin to despise one's neighbor. But blessed is the one who is kind to the needy. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker. And whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Proverbs 31:8-9 says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, the rights of those who are destitute." Verse 9, "Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy." Ezekiel 16:49 says, "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy." Anytime people talk about Sodom, they only talk about the immoral life that they lived. But Ezekiel brings us another truth about why Sodom was destroyed. The sin that Ezekiel identifies is that they were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned by the poor and the needy. And so, you see, this brings us to the notice that our Christianity cannot be complete until we have pity, compassion, we have love and concern for those around us who are needy and who are poor. This can be clearly explained also in many of the New Testament lessons. Luke 10:25-37. We know the story of the Good Samaritan. And the summary of the story of the Good Samaritan, as we learned from our topic, the irreducible minimum, says that if you love God, and of course if you love Him with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, then there's one way that you can demonstrate your love for God. That is loving your neighbor as yourself. So it is not just the spiritual gymnastics that people do show. It is not the involvement in programs and activities and the amount of prayer and fasting that shows your love for God. If truly you love Him through these actions, then one thing should be clear: love your neighbor. And we saw that your neighbor can be your wife, your husband, your pastor, your church member. It can be the orphan, the widow, the needy, the poor. It can be the Muslim brother, or even the animist. You love God? If yes, then that is the concern. Now, so you have to come out from that spiritual narrowness to understand the gospel comprehensively. When we read Matthew 25:31-46, we know of the story of the sheep and the goats. Verse 31, when the Son of Man comes in His glory and all the angels with Him, He will sit on His glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before Him, and He will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on His right and the goats on His left. Then the king will say, to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothing or clothes and clothes you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me." Now, when you read to the end, for those on the left, these were people who never gave regard to the sick, to the poor, to the naked, people in prison, and they completely ignore them. And when they ask, "When did we see you naked?" he said, "Because you didn't do it for the least of these people." The people we look down upon, people we disrespect, people we don't even count on. The good that we do to them is doing it for the Lord. And that's why it's so important for us to understand the gospel comprehensively, because here is the criteria on the judgment day. And the criteria is not because you're a powerful preacher, a good and excellent pastor, or a church planter, a missionary, a prayer warrior, a chorister. All these are good anyway. But he didn't mention any of this in this criteria. He said, "I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was naked. I was hungry." Right? "I was in prison." And you never. Now, so we have to come out from this very narrow perspective of the gospel, where concentration is put only on church programs and activities. James 2:14-17 says, "Faith and deeds. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but have no deeds? Can such faith save him or them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you say to him, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, dead." And so anytime you are talking about spirituality, about faith, works must go with it for it to be complete. Romans 13:9 says, "The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command it may be, are summed up this one command: love your neighbor." All the commands, the rules and regulations that we do have in church and programs are summed up in only one word: love your neighbor as yourself. See, from here we are seeing that true worship is more than religious activity. It is obedience to God, and it demonstrates God's love to others. Fasting involves not only temporary self-denial, but repentance and obedience to God. Temporary self-denial without a change of heart and behavior is hypocritical and displeasing to God. Religious activity is not a substitute for loving others. Religious activity without caring for the needy is not what God wants. Motives are important to God. He is pleased when we minister with right hearts. Ministry carried out for the wrong reason displeases Him. We are motivated by trying to look good to the community, to get more members, to gain convert for Christ, to fulfill needs, to love God, to obey God, to demonstrate His love. We should want to love and obey God by loving our unbelieving neighbors in ways that honor God. When a church witnesses to its neighbors in ways that are biblical and balanced, the community people better understand God's love, God's intentions, and God's vision for them in all areas of life. Those churches give a more accurate reflection of who God is and how He loves the people. And that's why we discuss that topic. The church is a window. The church is a window through which the broken man are the people in a community are looking, are watching to see the expressions of God's love right in these windows. Narrow view of the gospel. We see that true worship is more than religious activity. It is obedience to God. It demonstrates God's love to others. Religious activity is not a substitute for loving others. God does not want religious activity without caring for the needy. What are motives for ministry? Motives are important to God. Witnessing, ministering church demonstrates who God is, how He loves His people. Proverbs 3:1 and 2 says, "My son, do not forget my teaching. Keep them." My son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart. For they will prolong your life many years and bring you peace and prosperity. This is so important for us to understand. And that's why Jesus should be the center of whatever our Christian life is. He is the all in all. Our economic life, our financial life, our community life, our education, our agricultural life, every area of our life, Christ, the all in. And if you fully understand this, then you move away from your spiritual, the spiritual place that you find yourself, that you think that is the only way to serve God. Because serving God is spiritual, but spirituality is not only read the Bible and pray. Spirituality also how to do, taking care of the needy, poor, orphans, and also being compassionate to the broken world around you. And if Jesus is the center of your life, then every area of your life will be controlled by Him. So Jesus gives us the example. John 13:15. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Beloved, we can't be more spiritual than Jesus. Sometimes we pretend to be more spiritual than Him, but we can just do as He has shown us as an example. And John 13:17 says, now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them. Now that you know these things, come out from your narrowness, your narrow-mindedness, the narrow gospel. Gospel of Christ is the gospel of the kingdom. The kingdom is about all of life. That is why we are here, to represent his kingdom and make his kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you so much. The next week, Wednesday, wish you all the best. We love you. Give us your thoughts. Give us your impressions. If you have stories, sharing this gospel and also living it out, extending your love outside your church, to the neighborhood, even to people who are perceived enemies. You'll be sharing something wonderful for the kingdom. If you have such stories, please do share with us. Love you all, and God bless you.